I'm standing in the corner of Rosso Nero's main dining room with a silver tray of champagne flutes balanced on my palm, trying to make myself invisible the way I've perfected over the past 2 years. When the front doors open, and the entire restaurant seems to hold its breath in a way that makes my skin prickle with the kind of warning my Nonna Lucia used to say was the voice of our ancestors telling us to pay attention. The maitre d', Paolo, who never loses his composure even when celebrities and politicians demand tables he doesn't have, straightens his tie with hands that I can see trembling slightly from across the room, and I know without looking that someone important has just walked in. The kind of important that comes with danger wrapped in expensive Italian wool, and the sort of power that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already knows to be afraid. I risk a glance toward the entrance, keeping my head down the way I've trained myself to do, letting my dark hair fall forward to partially obscure my face. And that's when I see him for the first time, Dante Salvatore, whose name gets whispered in the kitchen and the break room with the kind of reverence and terror usually reserved for natural disasters or acts of God. Moving through the restaurant with the fluid confidence of a man who knows that every person in this room would step aside or step up, depending solely on what he required of them in any given moment. He's taller than I expected, maybe 6'3" or 6'4", with the kind of build that speaks of someone who hasn't forgotten that power sometimes requires physical enforcement. His dark hair swept back from a face that would be almost classically handsome if not for the hardness around his eyes and the thin white scar that cuts through his left eyebrow in a way that suggests violence survived rather than merely witnessed. But it's not Dante who makes my breath catch in my throat, and my grandmother's voice suddenly echo in my memory with painful clarity. It's the elderly man beside him, moving slowly with the aid of an ornate wooden cane that looks like it might be older than I am, his weathered face creased with lines that speak of decades lived under the Sicilian sun, and his bearing carrying the kind of dignity that doesn't diminish with age, but rather seems to intensify, as though every year has added another layer of authority that sits on his shoulders like an invisible crown. Don Carmine Salvatore, if the whispered conversations I've overheard are accurate. Dante's father, the man who supposedly built the Salvatore Empire from nothing but cunning and ruthlessness, and a willingness to do what softer men wouldn't, now semi-retired and living in Sicily, but occasionally visiting his son in Chicago, with the sort of fanfare that suggests his retirement is more theoretical than actual. Paolo is already rushing forward to greet them, his professional smile fixed in place even though I can see the tension in his shoulders, and I'm trying to fade further into my corner, to become part of the wallpaper or the elaborate floral arrangements that cost more than my monthly rent. When Don Carmine's cane catches on the edge of the Persian rug that runs down the center aisle between the tables. The cane twists in his grip and clatters to the marble floor with a sharp crack that makes several diners jump. And I watch as the old man's face flushes with embarrassment and frustration, his mouth opening to mutter something that I'm too far away to hear clearly. But that makes every instinct in my body go on high alert, because even from this distance, even though he's speaking quietly, I recognize the cadence and the sounds of something I haven't heard in far too long. Cius fortunatu un putia essere, he grumbles, the words floating across the suddenly silent restaurant, and my heart literally stops in my chest because he's not speaking Italian, not the modern standardized Italian that most people learn or the Tuscan-influenced dialect that's considered proper, but the old Corleone dialect, the one my Nonna Lucia used to speak when she thought no one outside our family was listening, the one she made me swear on her deathbed never to speak in public because it marked us, because it connected us to a world and a history that we needed to leave behind if I was ever going to be safe. I should stay frozen in my corner, should let Paolo or one of the other servers handle this, should remember every single reason why I've spent 2 years trying not to be noticed, or remembered, or connected to anything that might draw the wrong kind of attention. But my mouth is opening before my brain can engage, before common sense can override the reflexive response that Nonna Lucia drilled into me throughout my childhood, when she insisted I learn not just the words, but the soul of the language she'd carried with her from that small mountain village outside Palermo. Signoria, uvastu vi. I could do, I say, my voice quiet but carrying in the silence, and I'm already moving forward to pick up his cane, my tray somehow safely deposited on a nearby table, though I don't remember putting it down. My entire focus narrowed to this moment that I already know is going to change everything, even though I don't yet understand how or why. The old man's head snaps up so fast I'm worried he might hurt himself, his roomy brown eyes going wide with something that looks like shock, mixed with delight, and perhaps a touch of suspicion. And I'm suddenly aware that every single person in the restaurant is staring at me, including Dante Salvatore, whose dark eyes have locked onto my face with an intensity that makes me feel like a butterfly pinned to a board, examined and categorized and assessed for value or threat in the space of a single heartbeat. Tu pari come una picciotta dato villa, Don Carmine breathes, reaching out to take his cane from my hands with fingers that shake slightly, though whether from age or emotion I can't tell. And I can see tears gathering in the corners of his eyes as he studies my face with the kind of attention that suggests he's trying to memorize every feature, or perhaps comparing me to some memory that I couldn't possibly live up to. Me nonna m'insegnò, signori, I respond, keeping my eyes respectfully lowered the way Nonna Lucia taught me was proper when addressing elders, especially elders who carried the kind of weight that I can feel radiating from this man, like heat from a furnace. And I'm painfully aware that I've just revealed something about myself that I've kept hidden for 2 years, that I've just connected myself to a heritage and a history that I've been desperately trying to escape ever since I testified against Tommaso Russo and watched my entire life collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Dante is moving closer now, and I can feel the danger of him like a physical presence, can sense the way his men, because, of course he has men, scattered throughout the restaurant in positions that look casual, but that I now recognize as strategic, have shifted their attention fully to me, assessing whether I'm a threat or an opportunity, or simply a curiosity that their boss might want to explore further. Where did a girl like you learn to speak like someone from my father's village? Dante asks, his voice low and smooth and carrying an edge that suggests he's genuinely curious, but also that my answer will determine something important, something that might affect whether I walk out of this restaurant tonight on my own feet, or under very different circumstances. I'm trying to formulate a response that's truthful enough to satisfy but vague enough to protect what little privacy I have left, my mind racing through possible explanations and their potential consequences, when Don Carmine reaches out and grasps my hand with surprising strength. For someone his age, his weathered fingers wrapping around mine, with a warmth that's almost grandfatherly despite the fact that we've known each other for approximately 90 seconds. Dante, ci stu e u meglio regalo che potevi farmi, he says, his voice thick with emotion that I don't fully understand, speaking to his son but not releasing my hand. And I see something flicker across Dante's face. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion, or maybe just the calculation of a man who's trying to figure out how to use this unexpected development to his advantage. Paolo is hovering nearby, clearly unsure whether he should intervene or flee, or simply pretend this entire interaction isn't happening in the middle of his restaurant during the dinner rush. And I can see other diners trying not to stare while absolutely staring, their expensive meals forgotten in favor of watching whatever drama is unfolding between the Salvatores and their mysteriously Sicilian-speaking waitress. My manager, Susan, is watching from the doorway to the kitchen with an expression that suggests she's trying to decide whether to be impressed that I'm apparently impressing important customers, or furious that I've drawn this much attention to myself, when she's specifically told all of us that the key to good service at Rosso Nero is being helpful without being noticed. I think, Dante says slowly, his eyes never leaving my face as he addresses his father in English, probably for the benefit of everyone listening, that we need to hear this story, Papa. But perhaps not in the middle of the dining room where everyone can hear. He shifts his attention fully to me, and I feel the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, like being caught in the crosshairs of something predatory and patient and utterly focused. What time does your shift end, miss? Benedetto, I managed to say. My throat suddenly dry despite the fact that I've been sipping water all evening between serving tables, and I realize with a sinking sensation in my stomach that giving him my last name might have been a mistake, that he's absolutely going to have someone run a background check on me before I even finish clearing my section tonight, that whatever privacy and anonymity I've managed to maintain is about to be shredded like tissue paper in a storm. Isla Benedetto, and I'm supposed to work until 11, but I'm sure if you need me to— 11 is fine, Dante interrupts smoothly, and I notice that he's not asking, not requesting, but simply stating what's going to happen as though my agreement is a foregone conclusion, which I suppose it is given that refusing Dante Salvatore anything is probably not an option that ends well for the person doing the refusing. You'll join us at our table after you're finished with your other responsibilities, and you can tell my father all about how a waitress in Chicago came to speak the dialect of a village that most people in Sicily have never even heard of, let alone visited. Don Carmine is still holding my hand, and he pats it, gently before releasing me, his smile warm and genuine in a way that makes my chest tight with unexpected emotion, because it reminds me so strongly of Nonna Lucia, of the way she used to look at me when I got something right in the dialect lessons she insisted on, even when I complained that none of my friends had to learn ancient languages that nobody spoke anymore. Va bene, picciridda, va travagliare, ma dopo venetica che volemu parare cutia, he says, and even though he's giving me permission to go, I understand that it's not really permission so much as a command dressed up in grandfatherly affection. And I nod, because what else can I do when I've already revealed too much, and attracted exactly the kind of attention I've spent 2 years avoiding. I retrieve my tray on shaking legs, and somehow manage to make it back to the server station without dropping anything or collapsing, my mind racing through everything that just happened and all the ways it could go. Catastrophically wrong, because Dante Salvatore is not the kind of man whose interest you want to attract if you're trying to live quietly and avoid the attention of people connected to the world I thought I'd escaped. My coworker James gives me a wide-eyed look that's equal parts impressed and horrified, leaning in to whisper, "Do you have any idea who that is?" And I want to laugh at the absurdity of the question, because of course I know who he is. Everyone in Chicago who pays any attention to the news or listens to gossip knows who Dante Salvatore is, even if most of that knowledge exists in the realm of rumor and speculation, rather than anything that could be proven in a court of law. The rest of my shift passes in a blur of mechanical movements and racing thoughts, my hands somehow managing to deliver drinks and take orders and clear plates, while my brain spirals through increasingly anxious scenarios about what's going to happen when I sit down at that table, about what questions Dante is going to ask, and how much truth I can afford to tell without revealing that I'm not just some random girl who learned an obscure dialect from her grandmother, but rather someone with connections to the exact kind of world the Salvatores inhabit, someone who testified against a man whose organization probably does business with or against Dante's own interests, someone who has very good reasons for wanting to remain invisible and unremarkable and completely off the radar of anyone with power or connections or the resources to dig into backgrounds that are supposed to be sealed. When 11 o'clock finally arrives, I'm standing in front of the bathroom mirror trying to decide whether to attempt to fix my appearance or whether that would just draw more attention to the fact that I'm nervous. My reflection showing a woman who looks younger than her 24 years, with dark eyes that Nonna Lucia used to say held old souls and dark hair that's escaping from the neat bun I pinned it in 8 hours ago. And I'm struck by the sudden, terrifying thought that maybe Don Carmine sees something in my face that reminds him of Sicily, of people he used to know, of connections that I don't even know exist but that could unravel everything if he decides to pull on the right threads. I splash cold water on my face and tell myself that I can do this, that I've survived worse than a conversation with dangerous men, that all I have to do is tell them a carefully edited version of the truth about Nonna Lucia and her village, and then politely extract myself before they can dig any deeper into who I am or why I'm really here. But when I walk back into the dining room and see Dante and Don Carmine sitting at the best table in the restaurant, the one with the view of the Chicago skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. And when Dante stands with the kind of old-world courtesy that seems incongruous with everything else I know about him and pulls out the chair between him and his father, I realize with absolute certainty that there's no carefully extracting myself from this situation. That the moment I open my mouth and spoke in that dialect, I set something in motion that I don't understand and can't control. And that before this night is over, Dante Salvatore is going to know far more about me than is safe for either of us. I lower myself into the chair that Dante has pulled out for me with hands that I'm trying desperately to keep from shaking, acutely aware that this single gesture of courtesy, the standing, the chair pulling, the way he waits until I'm settled before returning to his own seat, is probably the most dangerous thing about this entire situation because it suggests a level of interest that goes beyond simple curiosity about a waitress who speaks an obscure dialect. And I can feel the weight of his attention on me like a physical presence even as I try to focus on Don Carmine's warm, grandfatherly smile that seems so at odds with everything I know about the Salvatore family and their reputation. Paolo has already placed a bottle of wine on the table, something that probably costs more than I make in a month based on the label I glimpsed, along with 3 crystal glasses that catch the light from the chandeliers overhead and throw tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. And I realize with a sinking sensation that this isn't going to be a quick conversation that I can gracefully exit after a few polite minutes, but rather something much more substantial and potentially much more dangerous to the carefully constructed life I've built over the past 2 years. So, Isla Benedetto, Dante says, and the way he pronounces my name, rolling the syllables with perfect Italian inflection, tells me that he's already thinking about it, already analyzing it for meaning and origin and connections, probably already mentally noting that Benedetto is a name that shows up in certain Sicilian families, with certain histories. My father seems to think you're some kind of miracle, appearing in Chicago speaking a dialect that he hasn't heard from anyone outside his childhood village in probably 60 years, and I have to admit that I'm intensely curious about how a young woman working as a waitress in my restaurant came to possess such a specific and unusual skill. He pours wine into all 3 glasses, with movements that are economical and practiced, and I notice that his hands are scarred across the knuckles in a way that speaks of violence personally administered, rather than merely ordered. And I have to resist the urge to pull back when he slides my glass across the table toward me, because showing fear would be worse than whatever danger I'm already in. Don Carmine reaches over and pats my hand again, with that same grandfatherly warmth that makes my chest ache with memories of Nonna Lucia. His weathered face creased with smile lines that somehow make him look less like the retired crime boss he supposedly is, and more like someone's beloved grandfather who might hand out hard candies and tell rambling stories about the old country. Dimmi, piccirida, di unie a tua famiglia, comuta rinesci a parlare così, come una picciotta che nasce una mestiza villa? He asks, his voice gentle but carrying an undercurrent of something that suggests this gentleness is a choice he's making rather than his default setting. And I understand with sudden clarity that this old man is probably more dangerous than his son, because he's had decades more practice at reading people and extracting information and knowing exactly which questions to ask to unravel someone's carefully guarded secrets. I take a sip of the wine to buy myself a few seconds to think, to sort through what I can safely tell them and what I absolutely need to keep hidden. And the wine is as expensive as I suspected. Smooth and complex and probably wasted on me since my knowledge of wine extends to being able to tell red from white and expensive from cheap. My grandmother, Lucia Benedetto, was born in Corleone. I begin, keeping my voice steady even though my heart is racing fast enough that I'm worried they might actually be able to hear it. In one of the small villages in the mountains outside the main town, where her family had lived for generations doing whatever mountain families do, farming, raising goats, trying to survive in a place where survival required toughness and loyalty to your neighbors, because there was nothing else to rely on. I can see both men watching me intently. Dante with those calculating dark eyes that miss nothing, and Don Carmine with an expression that's shifting between nostalgia and something that looks almost like recognition, as though I'm describing a world he knew intimately and perhaps loved despite whatever drove him to leave it. She came to America in 1958. I continue, my fingers wrapped around the wineglass stem like it's an anchor, keeping me grounded in this increasingly surreal conversation. Married my grandfather, who was also Sicilian, but from Palermo, had 3 children, including my father, and spent the rest of her life in a little house in Brooklyn, trying to recreate Sicily in a place that could never really be home the way the mountains were home. I'm editing as I go, leaving out the parts about why exactly Nonna Lucia left Sicily in such a hurry. About the whispered conversations I overheard as a child when she thought I was sleeping. About the photographs she kept hidden in a box under her bed that showed her with people whose names she would never speak, and whose faces I learned years later belonged to men who ended up in prison or dead, or disappeared into witness protection. She taught me the dialect when I was little, during the summers I spent with her after my mother died, insisting that I needed to know where I came from even if we could never go back. That language was the only thing we had. Left of that world and letting it die would be like erasing our own history. Don Carmine's eyes are definitely tearing up now, and he's speaking rapidly in the dialect. Something about how the mountains haven't changed, how the old ways are dying, how hearing me speak reminds him of his own mother, who used to sing to him in that same voice with those same particular inflections that mark someone as coming from that specific valley between those specific peaks. Dante is still watching me with that unnervingly focused attention, and I can practically see him cataloging every word I say, every gesture I make, every micro-expression that crosses my face, and I know with absolute certainty that he's already noticed something I'm hiding, already sensed that there's more to this story than a simple tale of linguistic preservation across generations. Your grandmother, Dante says slowly, interrupting his father's nostalgic monologue with a raised hand that Don Carmine immediately defers to, which tells me something about their family dynamics and who actually holds the power, despite the father's supposedly semi-retired status. What was her maiden name before she married your grandfather? It's a casual question, asked in the same tone someone might use to inquire about the weather. But I feel it like a blade sliding between my ribs because names matter in the world they come from. Because families are connected in ways that span generations and oceans. Because the wrong name could connect me to exactly the people I've been running from for 2 years. Teresi, I say, going with the truth because lying about something that basic would be stupid when he could verify it with a single phone call to someone with the right connections, and I watch his face carefully for any flicker of recognition, any sign that the name means something to him or connects to something problematic in my background. Lucia Teresi, from a family that had been in those mountains since before anyone was keeping records, farming the same difficult land and raising the same stubborn goats, and probably feuding with the same neighboring families over the same tiny insults for hundreds of years. I'm trying to make it sound mundane, trying to paint a picture of simple mountain people with no connections to anything more complicated than agriculture and animal husbandry. But I can see from Dante's expression that he's not entirely buying it, that something in my story isn't quite adding up for him, even if he can't yet put his finger on what's bothering him. Don Carmine launches into another story, this one about a girl he knew in his youth named Maria Teresi, who used to bring her family's cheese to the market and who had the most beautiful singing voice in the village. And I'm nodding and making appropriate sounds of interest, while my mind is racing through calculations about how much longer I can keep this up, about when I can politely excuse myself and get back to my small apartment where I can have a proper panic attack, about the fact that I've now connected myself to Dante Salvatore in a way that makes me visible when visibility is literally the most dangerous thing I could be. The restaurant has mostly emptied out around us, the other diners having finished their meals and departed, leaving just a few stragglers and the staff who are trying to look busy while obviously listening to our conversation with the kind of avid interest that will probably turn into gossip by tomorrow morning. How long have you been working at Rosso Nero? Dante asks, shifting the conversation with the smoothness of someone who's expert at extracting information through seemingly casual questions, and I notice that he's refilled my wine glass without my awareness, which means I've been drinking faster than I intended, which means my carefully maintained guard is probably slipping more than I realize. And why Chicago, specifically? Brooklyn to Chicago is a significant move, especially for someone who seems to value her Sicilian roots so deeply that she maintained a dying dialect into adulthood. It's phrased as curiosity, but I hear the real question underneath it. What are you running from? What brought you here? What are you hiding? And I realize that I'm going to have to give him something closer to the truth if I want him to stop digging. Because men like Dante Salvatore don't accept surface explanations when they sense depth beneath. I've been here for 2 years, I say carefully, trying to figure out how much I can reveal without painting a target on my back that's even bigger than the one I'm probably already wearing just from this conversation. And I came to Chicago because I needed a fresh start after a relationship ended badly. The kind of badly where staying in New York felt impossible and putting distance between my old life and my new one seemed like the smartest choice I could make. It's technically true, even if it massively, understates the reality of what ended badly actually means when your fiancé turns out to be the nephew of a major criminal figure, and you end up testifying before a grand jury about trafficking operations that span 3 states. Rosso Nero hired me because I speak Italian and understand Italian food culture, and I've stayed because the money is decent and the work is straightforward, and mostly I can just blend into the background and do my job without anyone paying too much attention to me. Dante's expression shifts slightly at that last part, one eyebrow rising in a gesture that might be amusement, or skepticism, or both. And I realize my mistake immediately. I've just told him that I want to be invisible, which is as good as admitting that I have reasons to hide, which is exactly the kind of information I should not be volunteering to a man with the resources and inclination to investigate anyone who captures his interest. Blending into the background seems like a waste for someone with your particular talents, he observes, his voice carrying that same smooth, dangerous quality that makes my pulse spike even though he hasn't said anything overtly threatening. And I have to wonder why a woman who speaks perfect Sicilian and has clearly had some education, I can hear it in how you structure your sentences in English, even when you're nervous, is content to work as a waitress when you could presumably be doing something that makes better use of your skills. Before I can formulate an answer that doesn't dig me deeper into whatever hole I'm currently standing in, his phone buzzes on the table, and I watch as he glances at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifts into something harder, something that reminds me exactly who and what he is beneath the expensive suit and the courteous manners. He answers in Italian, his voice clipped and professional. And I try not to listen, but it's impossible not to hear him discussing something about a shipment and a warehouse and someone named Russo, who apparently has been causing problems that need to be addressed. And that name, Russo, hits me like a physical blow, because of course there are multiple Russos in the world. Of course it's a common enough name that it could mean nothing. But the way my stomach drops and my hands go cold tells me that some part of me recognizes this as the universe's way of confirming that I can never really escape. That the past is always going to catch up no matter how far I run or how well I hide. Dante ends the call and looks at me with those dark, assessing eyes that seem to see straight through every defense I've ever constructed. And I know that he noticed my reaction, that he caught the way I went pale when he said that name, that he's now filing away this information along with everything else he's learned tonight, and probably already forming theories about what it means. You recognize that name, he says, and it's not a question, it's a statement, delivered with absolute confidence. And I realize that I've reached the point where I either need to tell him enough truth to satisfy his curiosity, or I need to find a way to extract myself from this situation immediately, even though leaving now would probably only make things worse. Don Carmine is watching both of us with an expression that suggests he's seeing something in this interaction that I haven't consciously acknowledged yet. Something in the way Dante is looking at me, or the way I'm unconsciously leaning slightly away from him, or the electricity that seems to crackle in the air between us. And when the old man smiles with something that looks almost like satisfaction, I feel a new kind of dread settle in my stomach because whatever he's thinking, whatever he's planning, I have the distinct impression that it's going to complicate my life in ways I can't even begin to predict. Tommaso Russo, I hear myself saying, my voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother's warnings about never revealing weakness echoing in my head even as I ignore them. Used to be someone I knew, someone connected to people I was involved with back in New York, and when you said that name it just caught me off guard because I haven't heard it in a long time, and I wasn't expecting to hear it here, in Chicago, in a conversation with you. I'm being deliberately vague, dancing around the specifics, but I can see from Dante's expression that vague isn't going to be good enough, that he's going to keep pushing until he gets the whole story. And I'm suddenly exhausted from the effort of trying to maintain boundaries that are clearly already compromised. Dante leans back in his chair, his posture deceptively relaxed, even though I can sense the coiled tension in him. The predatory focus that's now entirely directed at me, and the mystery I apparently represent. And when he speaks again, his voice has dropped into a register that's almost gentle, which somehow makes it more frightening than if he'd been obviously threatening. I think, he says slowly, his eyes never leaving my face, that you and I need to have a much longer conversation about Tommaso Russo and why hearing his name makes you look like you've seen a ghost. But that conversation needs to happen somewhere more private than the middle of my restaurant, where the staff is pretending not to listen while absolutely listening to every word we're saying. He glances at his father, some unspoken communication passing between them that I can't interpret, and then back to me with an expression that's impossible to read. My father is tired and needs to rest, but you and I are going to talk tomorrow evening, somewhere we won't be interrupted or overheard, and you're going to tell me the whole story about why a Sicilian girl from Brooklyn is hiding in Chicago and what Tommaso Russo has to do with it. Because that man is currently at the top of my list of problems that need to be permanently solved, and if you have information or connections that might be relevant to that situation, then you and I have a lot more to discuss than just your impressive command of an obscure dialect. The black car that arrives to pick me up the following evening is exactly the kind of vehicle I expected. Sleek, expensive, with windows tinted dark enough that I can't see who's inside until the driver, a man built like a linebacker with a face that suggests he's seen and done things that would give normal people nightmares, steps out and opens the rear door with the kind of professional courtesy that makes it clear this is not a request I can decline. I've spent the entire day alternating between anxiety attacks in the bathroom of my apartment and frantic internal debates about whether I should just disappear. Pack the single bag I've kept prepared for exactly this kind of emergency, and catch a bus to somewhere far away where the Salvatores and the Russos and everyone else connected to the world I've been fleeing can't find me, but something, maybe exhaustion, maybe curiosity, maybe just the bone-deep weariness of running for 2 years with no end in sight, has kept me rooted in place. And now I'm sliding into the back seat of this car wearing the nicest dress I own and trying not to think about all the ways this evening could go catastrophically wrong. The drive takes us along Lakeshore Drive toward the kind of neighborhood where the buildings have doormen and the apartments have price tags that would make my monthly salary look like pocket change. And I'm watching the Chicago skyline blur past the window while my mind races through everything I'm going to have to tell Dante tonight, trying to construct a version of the truth that's honest enough to satisfy him, but edited enough to protect whatever small measure of safety I've managed to build in this city. We pull up to a glass and steel tower that looks like it was designed to intimidate anyone who doesn't belong to the upper echelons of wealth and power, and the driver escorts me through a lobby that's all marble and modern art to a private elevator that requires a key card to operate. And I realize with a sinking sensation that I'm about to enter Dante Salvatore's personal space, his territory, where he has every advantage and I have absolutely none. The elevator opens directly into a penthouse that takes my breath away, despite my anxiety. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city and the lake beyond. Furniture that looks like it belongs in an art gallery rather than someone's home. And an overall aesthetic that manages to be both minimalist and luxurious, in a way that speaks of someone with extremely refined taste and unlimited resources to indulge it. Don Carmine is sitting in a leather armchair near the windows, a blanket over his lap despite the warmth of the evening, and his face lights up when he sees me in a way that makes my chest tight with complicated emotions because his genuine pleasure at my presence feels almost like a betrayal, given that I'm here under circumstances that are anything but genuinely friendly. Isla, Pichirida, veni cha ki taspitava, he calls out, gesturing for me to come closer, and I cross the expanse of polished hardwood floor feeling like I'm walking towards something inevitable and potentially devastating, trying to maintain some composure even though everything about this situation screams danger to every instinct I possess. Dante emerges from what I assume is the kitchen, carrying a bottle of wine and looking significantly more relaxed than he did last night. He's dressed in dark slacks and a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that are corded with muscle and marked with a few more of those scars I noticed on his hands. And there's something about seeing him in this more casual state that makes him seem both more human and somehow more dangerous because it strips away the formal veneer and reveals the raw power underneath. You came, Dante observes, and I can't tell if he's surprised or if he simply expected my compliance. But there's something in his expression that suggests he's pleased, which makes me wonder what he would have done if I'd tried to run, whether he would have let me go, or whether I would have found myself retrieved and brought here regardless of my preferences. My father has been looking forward to this all day, talking about you like you're some long-lost relative returned from the dead, and I have to admit that I'm equally interested in continuing our conversation from last night, particularly the part where you went pale at the mention of Tommaso Russo's name, and then tried to deflect with vague explanations that raised more questions than they answered. He pours wine for all three of us, with those same economical movements I noticed before, and I accept my glass, with hands that I'm proud to note are steadier than I expected given the circumstances. Don Carmine launches into a story about his childhood in Sicily, something about the summer festivals and the way the whole village would come together to celebrate saints' days with food and wine and music that lasted until dawn. And I find myself relaxing slightly despite the situation, because his enthusiasm is infectious, and his stories are genuinely interesting, painting a picture of a world that existed before jets and internet, and all the modern conveniences that make the earth feel smaller. Dante brings out food from the kitchen. Apparently he cooks, which is somehow surprising, even though it shouldn't be given that Italian men are often raised with an appreciation for good food. And the meal is simple but perfectly executed. Pasta with a sauce that tastes like it's been simmering for hours. Fresh bread that's still warm. A salad with vegetables that are probably from some exclusive market that I've never heard of. We eat and talk, or rather Don Carmine and I, talk while Dante watches and listens, contributing occasionally, but mostly seeming content to observe. And I'm acutely aware that this is an interrogation disguised as a pleasant dinner, that everything I say is being catalogued and analyzed and filed away for future reference. The old man asks me about my childhood, about Nonna Lucia, and the summers in Brooklyn, about what I remember of her stories about Sicily, and I find myself sharing memories I haven't thought about in years, the way she used to sing while cooking, the photographs she kept of mountains and villages I've never seen, the fierce pride she had in her heritage even though she could never go back to the place that formed her. Mi ricordi tanto Aida? Don Carmine says softly at one point, his eyes distant with memory. Umodu como parri? Umodu como ti movi? Puru umodu como sorrii quando parri da tua nonna? E como vidiri u fantasma di qualche picciotta che canuscia una volta, tanto tempo fa. There's something in the way he says it that makes me think he's not just making a general comparison, that maybe he actually knew someone who looked like me or moved like me or had some connection that I'm not aware of. But before I can ask him to clarify, Dante's phone buzzes again, and he glances at it with an expression that suggests whatever message he's received is both expected and unwelcome. Papa, you should rest, he says gently, helping the old man to his feet with a tenderness that seems at odds with everything else I know about Dante Salvatore. And I watch as Don Carmine shuffles off toward what I assume is a guest bedroom, pausing to kiss my cheek and pat my hand and murmur something in dialect about how happy he is that I came to dinner, how much it means to him to hear his language spoken by someone who understands not just the words, but the soul behind them. And then Don Carmine is gone, and I'm alone with Dante in this enormous penthouse high above the city, and the atmosphere shifts immediately into something sharper, more focused, less grandfatherly warmth and more predatory assessment. "So," Dante says, settling back into his chair and studying me with those dark eyes that seem to see everything I'm trying to hide. "Why don't you tell me the real story about you and Tommaso Russo? Because we both know that whatever you told me last night was carefully edited to avoid revealing anything actually useful. And I don't have the patience or the time to play games with someone who clearly has information about a man I've been trying to destroy for the past 5 years." His voice is calm, almost conversational, but there's steel underneath it. A reminder that this man doesn't ask questions unless he's prepared to enforce getting answers. I take a long drink of wine, buying myself a few seconds to decide how much truth I can afford to share. And then I start talking because what choice do I have? Because running hasn't worked and hiding hasn't worked, and maybe, just maybe, the truth might actually be my best option, even if it's terrifying to voice it out loud after 2 years of silence. "I was engaged to his nephew, Marco Russo, back in New York," I begin, watching Dante's face for any reaction and seeing only that same intense focus that suggests he's recording every word I say for later analysis. "We'd been together for about a year when I started noticing things that didn't add up. Expensive gifts that Marco couldn't possibly afford on his salary, phone calls he'd taken in another room, meetings with men who looked like they'd stepped out of a Mafia movie. And when I finally asked him directly what his family actually did for a living, he told me enough truth to make me understand that I was in way over my head, but not enough truth to actually protect myself if things went wrong." Dante leans forward slightly, his attention absolutely fixed on me now. And I continue because there's no point in stopping, no point in maintaining the fiction that I'm just some innocent waitress with an interesting linguistic background. "Marco's uncle, Tommaso Russo, runs a trafficking operation that spans from New York to Miami, moving everything from drugs to weapons to people. And Marco was being groomed to take over certain aspects of the business because apparently family loyalty is everything in that world, and blood connections matter more than competence or morality, or anything else that normal people might value." I can hear the bitterness in my own voice, the anger that I've kept suppressed for 2 years, bubbling up now that I'm finally speaking these truths out loud. Tommaso decided that having Marco marry me would be good for appearances, that I came from a respectable Sicilian family and had no criminal connections, and would make the perfect cover for legitimizing their operations. And Marco went along with it, because you don't tell Tommaso Russo no when he's decided what's best for the family. "But you did tell him no," Dante observes, and there's something almost like respect in his voice, or maybe just curiosity about how I managed to extract myself from a situation that most people wouldn't survive. "You didn't just break off the engagement and disappear. You did something that made you dangerous enough to them that you've been hiding for 2 years, something significant enough that hearing Tommaso's name last night made you look like you'd been punched in the stomach." He refills my wine glass without asking, and I notice that his movements are careful, controlled, as though he's trying not to spook me even though we both know that I'm already in too deep to run. "The FBI approached me about 6 months before the wedding was supposed to happen," I say, the words coming faster now that I've started, like a confession that's been building pressure for too long and needs to be released before it explodes. "They had been investigating the Russo family for years but couldn't get anyone on the inside to talk. Couldn't get the kind of evidence they needed to actually build a case that would stick. And then suddenly there I was, engaged to Marco, invited to family dinners and events, trusted enough that people talked relatively freely around me because I was supposed to become family, and family is supposed to be safe." I close my eyes briefly, remembering the fear of those months, the weight of the wire I wore to gatherings, the constant terror that someone would notice, that I'd make a mistake that would get me killed. They convinced me that helping them was the right thing to do, that I'd be saving the lives of all the people Tommaso's organization was hurting, that I'd be protected afterward and given a new identity and a fresh start somewhere far from New York. "But they didn't protect you," Dante says. And it's not a question because he can clearly see that I'm here, in Chicago, working as a waitress under what I assume is still my real name, without any of the security or anonymity that witness protection is supposed to provide. You wore their wire, you gathered their evidence, you testified before their grand jury, and then they what? Told you that you were on your own because the case didn't go the way they hoped? There's anger in his voice now, not directed at me, but at the situation, at the people who used me and then abandoned me. And I'm surprised by it because I didn't expect Dante Salvatore to care about the unfairness of federal prosecutors leaving their witnesses vulnerable. The indictment didn't lead to a conviction, I explain, opening my eyes to find him watching me with an expression I can't quite read. Tommaso's lawyers got most of the evidence thrown out on technicalities, witnesses recanted their statements, or disappeared before trial. And the case fell apart spectacularly enough that the prosecutors decided it wasn't worth pursuing, which meant I'd burned my entire life to the ground for nothing except making myself a target for a man who now knows I tried to destroy him and his family. My voice cracks slightly on the last words, and I hate showing that weakness, but I'm too tired and too wrung out to maintain the facade of being fine. The FBI said they couldn't offer me witness protection because technically the case never went to trial, that the best they could do was suggest I relocate and keep a low profile. So I took what money I had saved and came to Chicago, because it was far enough from New York to feel safe but close enough to my grandmother's grave in Brooklyn that I could visit if I needed to. And I've spent 2 years trying to be invisible and unremarkable and completely forgettable so that Tommaso's people would hopefully give up looking for me. Dante is quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his wine glass in a rhythm that suggests he's thinking, calculating, working through implications and possibilities that I probably can't even imagine. Tommaso Russo, he finally says, his voice low and carrying an edge of something dark and dangerous, is responsible for the death of my younger sister Giuliana 5 years ago. The words land like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread outward and change everything about this conversation, about why he cares about my story, about what he might want from me beyond simple information. She was 19, in her second year at Northwestern, smart and beautiful and full of life, and she bought what she thought was legitimate medication from someone at a party, but what she actually got was contaminated synthetic opioids that came from one of Russo's distribution networks, and she died in her dorm room before anyone even knew she was in trouble. I feel my heart clench with sympathy and understanding, remembering the pain in Don Carmine's eyes when he talked about family, about loss, about the way the old ways included fierce loyalty and equally fierce vengeance for wrongs committed against those you love. I'm so sorry, I say, knowing the words are inadequate but meaning them anyway. And Dante waves off my condolences with a gesture that suggests he's heard them too many times, and they've long since lost any power to comfort him. I've spent the past 5 years systematically dismantling Tommaso Russo's organization, Dante continues, his voice taking on a quality that makes me understand exactly how dangerous he is, exactly what he's capable of when someone threatens what he considers his. I've destroyed his supply chains, corrupted his distribution networks, turned his own people against him, driven him out of markets he thought he controlled, and made it my personal mission to ensure that every day he wakes up is a little worse than the day before, building toward the moment when I can finally finish what your FBI couldn't and make sure he never hurts another family the way he hurt mine. He looks at me directly now, and I see something in his eyes that's both terrifying and oddly compelling. Absolute conviction, unwavering purpose, the kind of focused determination that moves mountains and destroys empires. So you can understand why having you suddenly appear in my restaurant, speaking my father's language and carrying information about Russo that might be useful, feels like the universe finally giving me a tool I can use to end this war once and for all. What do you want from me? I ask, even though I'm not sure I want to hear the answer, even though every survival instinct I have is screaming that getting further involved with Dante Salvatore is possibly more dangerous than anything Tommaso Russo could do to me. Because I already risked everything once to try to stop Russo and it didn't work. It just made me a target and destroyed my life. and I don't know what else I could possibly offer you that would be worth dragging all of that back to the surface. Dante stands and walks to the windows, looking out over the city lights spread beneath us like scattered diamonds, and when he turns back to face me, his expression is intense, serious, carrying the weight of a decision that I can sense is going to change both of our lives in ways neither of us can fully predict. "I want you to stay under my protection," he says, and the words sound almost reasonable until I process what he's actually suggesting, what being under Dante Salvatore's protection would mean, how it would look to everyone who knows who he is and what he represents. "Let Tommaso think you're mine, my woman, under my care, off limits to anyone who values their life, and help me finish what you started with your testimony. Give me access to whatever information you have about his operations, about his weaknesses, about the details that someone who was almost family would know, and I'll make sure you never have to hide again, never have to look over your shoulder, never have to worry that someday Russo's people are going to figure out where you are and come to settle accounts." I stare at him, trying to process this offer that's simultaneously terrifying and strangely appealing, wondering if he realizes what he's suggesting, what the implications would be for both of us. "And what does being yours actually mean?" I hear myself asking, my voice steadier than I expected given that my heart is racing and my mind is spinning through all the possible interpretations of that phrase, all the ways this arrangement could go wrong or compromise what little independence I've managed to maintain. Dante moves closer, not quite invading my personal space, but near enough that I can feel the heat radiating from him, can see the fine details of those scars on his hands, and the way his dark eyes seem to hold depths I couldn't hope to fathom. "It means," he says carefully, his voice low and carrying an intimacy that makes my breath catch, "that to the outside world you and I are together. You live here under my roof. You appear with me at events where being seen matters. You let everyone who needs to know understand that you're under my protection, and that touching you would mean declaring war on me and everything I control." He pauses, studying my face with that same intense focus. "What it means privately, between you and me, is something we can negotiate. But I'm not asking you to be anything you don't want to be. I'm offering you a chance to stop running, to stop hiding, to take back some measure of power over your own life, while helping me destroy the man who's made both of our lives hell in different ways. I should say no, should recognize this for the devil's bargain it obviously is, should understand that accepting protection from someone like Dante Salvatore comes with strings and obligations and complications that I can't even begin to imagine. But when I open my mouth to politely decline and extract myself from this situation with whatever dignity I can manage, what comes out instead is a question that surprises both of us. "If I agree to this, if I help you and play whatever role you need me to play publicly, can you actually keep me safe? Can you really protect me from Russo's people if they come looking? Or am I just trading one dangerous situation for another one that might be worse?" Dante's smile is slow and dangerous and full of dark promise, and when he speaks, his voice carries absolute certainty that's somehow more convincing than any oath or guarantee. "Isla," he says, my name rolling off his tongue with that perfect Italian pronunciation that makes it sound like something precious and protected. "By tomorrow evening, everyone who matters in this city, and that includes whatever spies and connections Russo has in Chicago, will know that you belong to me, and anyone foolish enough to touch what's mine doesn't live long enough to regret the mistake." I wake up the next morning in a guest bedroom that's larger than my entire apartment, surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and staring at a ceiling that's so high it makes me feel small and insignificant. And for a long moment I lie there trying to convince myself that last night was some kind of fever dream, that I didn't actually agree to become Dante Salvatore's publicly acknowledged woman in exchange for protection and a chance at revenge against the man who's haunted my nightmares for 2 years. The sound of voices speaking in rapid Italian drifts through the door, Dante and his father, discussing something that sounds simultaneously mundane and weighted with significance, and I force myself out of bed to face whatever this new reality is going to demand of me. Pulling on the robe that someone thoughtfully left draped across the chair in the corner, and padding barefoot across marble floors that are heated to exactly the right temperature, because of course Dante Salvatore's penthouse would have heated floors. When I emerge into the main living area, I find both men at the dining table with what looks like a full Italian breakfast spread before them. Fresh pastries, fruit, espresso in delicate cups, and the morning paper that Dante is reading with the kind of focused attention most people reserve for holy texts, while Don Carmine is regarding me with a smile so warm and genuine that it makes my chest ache with complicated emotions about what I've gotten myself into. Buongiorno, piccirida, veni che ti fazzo una tazza di caffè, the old man says, already standing to prepare my coffee before I can protest. And I watch as he moves around the kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of someone who's spent significant time in this space, suggesting that his visits to Chicago are perhaps more frequent and extended than I initially understood, which makes sense if he's still involved in family business, despite his supposedly retired status. Dante looks up from his paper, and his eyes do a quick assessment of me that I feel like a physical touch, taking in the sleep-mussed hair and the bare face and the way the robe gaps slightly at the throat, and something in his expression shifts into what might be approval, or possessiveness, or simply satisfaction that I'm actually here. That I didn't somehow slip away during the night, despite having nowhere to go, and no realistic escape plan. "We have a busy day ahead of us," he announces, setting down the paper and reaching for his espresso, with movements that are economical and practiced. And I notice that he's already dressed in another perfectly tailored suit that probably costs more than I made in 6 months at the restaurant, looking every inch the powerful businessman rather than the dangerous criminal that I know lurks beneath the expensive veneer. "I've arranged for some people to come here this afternoon to help you with clothing and whatever else you need. And tonight we're attending a charity gala at the Drake, where I've made sure that everyone who matters will see us together. Which means, by tomorrow morning, Tommaso Russo will know exactly where you are and who you're with, and we can begin the next phase of this arrangement." The casual way he says it, as though announcing that my location will be revealed to the man who wants me dead, is just another item on today's agenda between coffee and whatever else he has planned. Makes my stomach clench with anxiety that I try to hide behind accepting the cup of espresso that Don Carmine presses into my hands with grandfatherly concern. "You're moving very fast," I observe, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my heart is racing at the thought of being deliberately exposed after 2 years of careful hiding. And Dante's slight smile suggests he knows exactly how terrified I am and finds it either endearing or irrelevant to his plans. "Speed is necessary when dealing with men like Russo," he explains, his tone taking on the quality of someone educating a student in strategies they don't yet understand, and I'm reminded that despite his relative youth, he can't be more than 35. Dante has been playing this game for years, has survived and thrived in a world where hesitation or uncertainty can be fatal. If we give him time to think, time to plan, time to consider his options, he'll approach this situation strategically and will lose the advantage of his initial emotional response. But if we move quickly and put you in his face immediately, his reaction will be driven by anger and possessiveness and the need to reclaim something he thinks belongs under his sphere of influence, which will make him sloppy and predictable in ways that serve our purposes. He reaches across the table to refill my espresso cup without asking, and I notice that his hands are steady, calm, carrying none of the anxiety that's currently making my own fingers tremble slightly against the delicate porcelain. Don Carmine settles back into his chair and begins talking about the gala, about how these charity events are where Chicago's elite come to see and be seen, where business gets conducted under the guise of philanthropy and alliances get formed or broken over champagne and canapes. And I realize that he's essentially giving me a crash course in the social dynamics I'm about to be thrust into, preparing me for a world I've only ever observed from the outside as a waitress serving people I could never hope to join. "Tu sei una bella picciota," he tells me with absolute conviction, switching into dialect in that way. He does when he wants to emphasize something important. "E quando Dante ti portassi qua stasera, tutti umunnu vidissi casina femmina che apparteni a nomu putenti, E nudu, manco russo, po tu cariti senza dichiarare guerra contro tutta famiglia Salvatore. The weight of what he's saying settles over me like a physical thing. That by appearing with Dante tonight, I'm not just accepting his protection, but essentially declaring myself part of his world, part of his family, connected to everything the Salvatore name represents, in ways that go far beyond a simple business arrangement. What if I'm not ready for this? I ask, directing the question to both of them, but looking at Dante because ultimately he's the one who's orchestrating this entire situation, who's decided that the best way to protect me and use me against Russo is to make me visible in the most dramatic way possible. What if I make a mistake tonight, say the wrong thing, or do something that makes people question whether this is real, whether you and I are actually together in the way you need everyone to believe we are? Dante's expression softens slightly, and he stands from the table to come around to where I'm sitting, crouching down so that we're at eye level in a gesture that feels oddly intimate despite the presence of his father, watching us with ill-concealed interest and approval. "You won't make a mistake," he says with absolute confidence that I wish I could share, and then he reaches out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear in a gesture that's almost tender, almost genuine, almost enough to make me forget that this is all performance and strategy rather than actual affection. "All you have to do is stay close to me. Let me lead. And remember that everyone there will be watching to see if you're worthy of the position you're occupying. If you're strong enough and composed enough and intelligent enough to stand beside a man like me. And I already know that you are all of those things and more. Which is why this arrangement is going to work perfectly." His hand lingers against my cheek for just a moment longer than necessary, and I see something flicker in his dark eyes that suggests maybe, just maybe, there's more to his interest in me than simple strategic calculation, though I'm not naive enough to trust that impression when so much is at stake. The rest of the morning passes in a blur of activity that leaves me feeling overwhelmed and slightly dazed. A stylist arrives with racks of designer clothing and begins the process of determining what will work for my body type and the image Dante wants to project. A hairstylist sets up in one of the bathrooms and spends an hour discussing options, while Don Carmine offers opinions in dialect about what would look most beautiful. And through it all, Dante conducts business on his phone and laptop, occasionally glancing up to assess whatever transformation is being performed on me with an expression that's impossible to read. By late afternoon, I'm standing in front of a full-length mirror, wearing a dress that probably costs more than I used to make in 3 months. Deep emerald green that brings out the darkness of my eyes and clings to curves I usually try to hide. My hair swept up in a style that's elegant and sophisticated, and when I catch Dante's reflection in the mirror behind me, I see something in his face that makes my breath catch. Genuine appreciation mixed with possessiveness and something darker that might be desire or might just be satisfaction at how well his plan is coming together. "Perfect," he murmurs, and I'm not sure if he's talking about the dress or the overall effect or something else entirely, but the word settles over me like a benediction and a claim all at once, and I realize that whatever happens tonight at the gala, whatever comes after when Russo inevitably learns where I am and who I'm with, I've already crossed a threshold that I can never uncross, already committed myself to a path that leads toward either redemption and safety or destruction in ways I can't yet predict. Don Carmine comes to stand beside me, and when he looks at my reflection, his eyes are misty with emotion that seems disproportionate to the situation until he speaks in our shared dialect, his voice thick with memory and meaning that I don't fully understand. "Si proprio ugualia ida, a me prima amuri, a femmina calassaina Sicilia quando eramu, giovini, e videnuti ca come figiu, e come si destinu finalmente ci desina secunda possibilità tutto kiddu capirsi tanto tempo fa." I turn to look at him directly, my mind racing to translate and process what he's just told me. That I remind him of his first love, the woman he left behind in Sicily when he was young, and that seeing me here with his son feels like destiny giving him a second chance at everything he lost so long ago. And suddenly everything clicks into place. All those meaningful looks and the immediate connection and the way he's treated me like family from the first moment I spoke in dialect. Because somehow, in some way I don't yet fully understand. I represent something to him that goes far deeper than simple nostalgia for the old country. Before I can ask him to explain, before I can demand the whole story that I can sense lurking beneath his words, Dante's phone rings with the tone that I've learned means important business, and I watch as his expression shifts into something hard and focused as he answers, and then listens to whatever information is being delivered on the other end, his jaw tightening in a way that suggests the news is both expected and unwelcome. And when he ends the call and looks at me, his eyes hold a dangerous gleam that makes my pulse spike with equal parts fear and something that might be anticipation. "Russo just made a move," Dante says, his voice carrying that steel-edged quality that I'm learning means he's shifted into the mode where he's not just a man, but a force, a power, something that reshapes reality according to his will. "He sent men to your old apartment in Chicago, the one you've been paying rent on even though you haven't lived there in weeks, and when they found it empty, they started asking questions at the restaurant, which means he knows you've disappeared, and he's going to be looking for answers, looking for any sign of where you might have gone or who might be protecting you, which makes tonight's appearance even more critical because we need to control the narrative before he starts drawing his own conclusions that might be more dangerous than the truth." He crosses the room to stand directly in front of me, his hands coming up to rest on my shoulders with a grip that's firm but not painful. And when he speaks again, his voice carries absolute conviction, mixed with something that might be concern, or might just be determination to protect what he's claimed as his. "Once we walk into that gala together, once people see you on my arm wearing my protection like a visible shield, there's no going back from this. No pretending it was a misunderstanding or a temporary arrangement, because Tommaso Russo is going to understand exactly what you being with me means, and his response is going to be everything we're counting on to finally bring him down permanently. But it's also going to put you in the crossfire of a war that's been building for 5 years, and I need you to be absolutely certain that you're ready for what comes next." The charity gala at the Drake Hotel is exactly as overwhelming as I anticipated. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbow prisms across a ballroom filled with Chicago's elite, women in designer gowns that cost more than cars, men in tuxedos conducting business deals disguised as casual conversation, and all of it swirling around me like a glittering tornado while I stand at Dante's side trying to project the kind of confidence and composure that a woman under his protection would naturally possess, even though my heart is racing and my hand trembles slightly where it rests in the crook of his arm. The moment we entered together, the room fell into one of those brief, telling silences where everyone pretends they weren't staring while absolutely cataloging every detail of my appearance, my bearing. The way Dante's hand settles possessively at the small of my back with a familiarity that suggests ownership and intimacy that goes beyond mere professional arrangement, and I can practically feel the gossip spreading through the crowd like wildfire, whispers about who I am and where I came from, and what it means that Dante Salvatore has publicly claimed a woman for the first time in years. Within 48 hours of that night, everything changes in ways both terrifying and liberating. Russo's men make their move with the kind of clumsy desperation that Dante predicted, attempting to grab me outside a boutique where I'm shopping with a security detail that I'm still not entirely comfortable having. But that proves its worth when 3 of Russo's soldiers end up dead in an alley, and I end up completely unharmed but shaking with the realization that this is real, that the danger Dante promised to protect me from is not theoretical but immediate and violent, and only held at bay by his willingness to respond with overwhelming force. The aftermath is handled with the kind of efficiency that speaks to years of practice. Bodies disappear, witnesses forget what they saw, and by the time the police arrive, there's nothing to investigate except some bloodstains that could have come from anywhere. And I'm back in the penthouse with Dante's arms around me while he murmurs reassurances in Italian against my hair, and I try to process the fact that men just died because of me, because of decisions I made, because I agreed to make myself visible in ways that invited exactly this kind of response. But it's 3 days later when everything truly shifts, when Don Carmine calls me to his room with that gentle insistence that I've learned means he has something important to share. And I find him sitting in the chair by the window with afternoon sunlight making his white hair glow like a halo, holding a photograph that looks like it's been handled so many times the edges are soft and worn. Venica, piccirida, c'è una storia kataju kuntari, he says, patting the seat beside him with a hand that trembles slightly with age and emotion. And when I settle next to him, he passes me the photograph with a reverence that suggests it's one of his most precious possessions. And I find myself looking at a young woman who could be my twin. Same dark eyes, same bone structure, same half-smile that I've seen in my own mirror, standing beside a young man I recognize as Don Carmine, despite the decades that separate this image from the elderly man beside me. Lucia Torrisi, he says, his voice thick with emotion that he's no longer trying to hide. And my world tilts sideways because that's my grandmother's name. My Nonna Lucia, who taught me the dialect and the stories, and never ever mentioned that she had any connection to the Salvatore family, or to this man who's looking at me now with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. A me prima e sulu veru amuri. A femmina ca volia sposare quando eramu picciotti in Sicilia, prima ca a me famiglia decidia ca via sposare in autra pi. Convenienza prima ca tutto si complicau e idda fuggia all'America pi scappare du dolori di perderimi. He takes the photograph back with shaking hands, holding it like it might dissolve if he's not careful, and begins telling me a story that rewrites everything I thought I knew about my grandmother's past. How she and Carmine had grown up in neighboring villages. How they'd fallen in love as teenagers despite family objections. How they'd planned to run away together before his father forced him into an arranged marriage with a woman from a powerful Palermo family. And how Lucia had left for America, rather than watch him build a life with someone else. Ida aspettava un figlio, me figlio, quando partia, Don Carmine continues. And this revelation lands like a physical blow because it means my father wasn't the son of the man I called grandfather. Means that everything about my family history is more complicated than the simple immigrant story I was raised believing. Means that I carry Salvatore blood in my veins, whether I want to acknowledge it or not. Manco sapia di sta granizza quando nigia, e quando scopria a veritati. Era troppo tardo pi canciare cica facia, troppo tardo pi tornare in Sicilia e riclamare chi duca era me. A così si maritau con altro uomo siciliano, ca era bono abbastanza per riconoscere, u piccilidru come so proprio figliu. E io mai sapia che avia un figliu nato munnu finù a quando idda moria, e lassa una littra che m'arrivau troppo tardi pi cagnare ci duca fussi statu. I'm crying now, unable to stop the tears that stream down my face as I process what he's telling me. That my father was Don Carmine's biological son. That my grandmother carried this secret to her grave. That the man sitting beside me is not just someone who reminds me of family but actually is family. My grandfather in blood, if not in name. And suddenly every meaningful look and instant connection and the way he's treated me like precious lost treasure makes perfect sense. Tu sia me niputedda, he says, reaching out to cup my face with both hands, the way Nonna Lucia used to do when I was small. U sangu du me sangu. A sulu connessioni ca mi resta qua femmina ca mai chiudi tutto un munnu, e videndo Dante guardariti culocchi precisi come me quando tagliava a to nonna, capisci ca u destino finalmente ci ha dato una possibilità di mettere a posto chi duca sbagliai tanto tempo fa. When Dante comes home an hour later and finds us both crying, finds his father explaining in rapid dialect mixed with Italian that I'm not just some random girl he feels affection for, but actually his granddaughter, the biological descendant of the love he lost and never stopped mourning. I watch something profound shift in Dante's expression, understanding dawning, pieces clicking into place about why his father pushed so hard for this arrangement, why he seemed to see fate's hand in my sudden appearance. So, this stopped being a convenient business arrangement the moment you walked into my restaurant, Dante says slowly, addressing me directly while his father watches with ill-concealed satisfaction. And there's something in his voice that suggests he's not upset by this revelation, but rather relieved, as though it gives him permission to acknowledge feelings he's been keeping, carefully contained, beneath strategic calculation. Your family, your blood, you're connected to us in ways that go far deeper than protection or revenge or any of the rational reasons I told myself justified keeping you close. The final confrontation with Russo comes sooner than expected, but exactly as Dante planned. Emboldened by rage and the need to reclaim what he sees as property that's been stolen, Tommaso makes the fatal mistake of coming to Chicago personally to retrieve me, bringing enough men and weapons to start a war, but not enough intelligence to realize he's walking into a trap that's been carefully constructed using my knowledge of his operations combined with Dante's resources and connections. The details of that night are something I try not to think about too carefully. The sound of gunfire, the smell of blood and cordite, the cold efficiency with which Dante's people dismantle Russo's final desperate play. But what matters is that when morning comes, Tommaso Russo is dead. His organization is in ruins, and the threat that's haunted me for 2 years has been permanently eliminated in ways that the FBI could never accomplish through legal channels. In the aftermath, as I stand in Dante's penthouse watching the sun rise over Lake Michigan, with his arms wrapped around me from behind, and Don Carmine sleeping peacefully in the next room, knowing he's finally found the family he lost so many decades ago, I realize that everything Nonna Lucia taught me about the dialect, about heritage, about never forgetting where we came from, was her way of keeping a door open to the past she'd fled, a path back to the love she sacrificed, and the life she might have lived if circumstances had been different. And now here I am, her granddaughter, standing in the space where that past and present finally converge, no longer running or hiding, but rather claimed and protected and loved. Because somewhere in the midst of strategy and revenge and carefully constructed arrangements, Dante and I crossed the line from performance into genuine connection, from protection into partnership, from convenient fiction into something real and precious and worth fighting to preserve. Ti voglio bene, Dante murmurs against my temple, the words in Italian carrying weight that English couldn't match, and when I turn in his arms to kiss him properly, I taste possibility and promise and the strange alchemy of fate that brought me to this moment, this man, this family that I didn't know I belonged to until I opened my mouth and spoke my grandmother's language in a restaurant full of strangers and set in motion events that would transform everything I thought I knew about who I am and where I belong in this dangerous, beautiful, complicated world that now feels, for the first time in years, like something I can finally call home.